Yeah, so if my last one didn't piss somebody off, I'm sure this one will. Or it'll get me called insensitive, or someone's going to accuse me of not caring about kids, and the usual nonsense. Because guess what we're talking about today? This is the aforementioned and promised discussion of gun control. Yeah, gun control. Okay, so that's back in the news again because we have yet another one of these shootings that has occurred. And I'm going to preface this by saying that I don't think there's any question these shootings are tragic. Obviously, no one on either side of this debate who is honest would be saying that anybody else was in support of this or wanted more of them. I mean, it's tragic. People are getting killed. Many times they're true innocents, children, somebody who's just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They are tragic. And, of course, you have the usual suspects trotting out the usual arguments about gun control and how we could put a stop to these shootings if only we would adopt this ban or that ban or this restriction or that restriction, or expanded background checks. And many times it's some measure that has nothing whatsoever to do with whatever the shooting was. I mean, a perfect example of this is you have a nightclub shooting involving a handgun, and we have these same people talking about banning AR-15s. Okay. Yeah. So I may have misspoken there. That may actually it wasn't an AR-15 of that much, I'm sure, because that was all over the news. That the first thing they say is, "Oh, it was an AR-15," and it comes out later it wasn't an AR-15. But I may be mistaken. My recollection is it was a handgun, but I could be wrong about that. Do your own homework. Anyway, so gun control. I'm going to come out and say that from my perspective, I don't support it. And I could say for several reasons. Some of them are what I would call substantive policy reasons, and others have to do with substantive rights. We'll start with the most obvious. Second Amendment says you have the right to own a weapon. For the wording is keep and bear arms. Traditional interpretation means that includes firearms. So, right out of the bat, this is a right we're talking about. It's a constitutionally protected right. And if you really think about what it is we're talking about, it's also an interest in autonomy. And I say this because if you own a firearm, you at least have the option to take your safety into your own hands at some level. No, it does not mean you don't need the police. No, it does not mean you don't need a military. But it does mean that in an immediate emergency, you do have the option of defending yourself with deadly force because you have a weapon. Guns are a great equalizer. Somebody who is physically small, physically weak, is suddenly equalized to somebody who's big and powerful, because even the big and powerful person is going to be vulnerable to a bullet. So right out of the chute, when you talk about firearms and the ownership of firearms, it's an autonomy interest, because you are somewhat more autonomous with a gun than without a gun. As to what level of autonomy, well, that's somewhat dependent on the individual and how serious they are about arming themselves for the purpose of personal defense. But I do believe, I would posit that it is, in fact, an autonomy interest. That's the first thing. Second thing, you always hear the pro-gun crowd talk about what the reason for this interest is protection against a tyrannical government. I am not going to sit here and start talking about let's rise up against the state or federal governments. My position on it is I'm a rule of law guy, and you'll probably hear me use that term a lot. In most circumstances, I think if you have a grievance or a dispute, it can and properly should be handled within the legal system. Now, I will confess the legal system we have in this country is imperfect. It has its flaws. It has its biases. And it is unfortunately influenced by politics in ways it shouldn't be. That being said, I'd still argue we have one of the best, if not the best, legal systems in the world, despite its flaws. And I also will say that I think rule of law is better than rule of men or anarchy, even with its flaws. So, having said these things, I don't believe in the idea of if you don't like what's going on, take up your arms and go overthrow the government in most circumstances. I do think there are exceptions, but generally speaking, this is not my position. And as far as what I'm saying today, I don't want anybody who listens to this video to hear me in any way, and I'm being very, very clear, in any way calling for armed rebellion. This country is not at that point. I don't think we have gotten anywhere near that point. I think we have our problems, sure, but I think they can be resolved within the political and legal system. And any country is going to have its flaws and problems. That goes without saying. So, but yes, there is that argument about being armed, is it makes it harder for the government to dominate you and treat you in a tyrannical manner. And an armed populace tends to discourage that. And yes, I'm aware of the counter-argument on the gun control side is the government is far better armed than private citizens, which is accurate, assuming the military sides with the federal government or the state, the National Guard sides with the state, and the police side with the state. Yeah, they're better armed. They have weapons that the private civilian world does not. Nevertheless, the civilian world has the numbers, and numbers are a factor. Plus, and this is something that if you study history at all, this is something to understand. I don't care how good your military is, if you don't have industry and popular support behind it, it can't fight a war. Doesn't matter how well armed they are, doesn't matter how good they are, how well trained they are, how advanced they are. I mean, all you have to do, just as an example of this historically speaking, you want to look at what happens when you don't have industrial backing. Look at World War II Germany. Germany, for a good chunk of that war, had the technological edge. They had weapons nobody else had. And they had some of the best tanks in the war. But the problem they had is that their factories all got bombed out. One, and two, they also had a shortage of petroleum, because they didn't have their own oil wells. But my point still stands. You need those materials and supplies to run a military. Where do those come from? Civilians. So somebody's got to work the factories. Somebody's got to work the oil rigs. Somebody's got to work the refineries to keep your military supplied. And if the general public says, screw you government, we're done, in a large enough number, you will not have those things. The military will fall apart. Sorry, I got a little bit off track there, but the point I'm getting at is those are the general purposes that are cited for why we have a Second Amendment, and it is a right. I'm not in support of tinkering with fundamental rights without a really good reason and proof that, and a really good, when I say a really good reason, as in I can point to this immediate harm that arises from this specific conduct under this specific right. And there's really no less restrictive way to get at the problem. That's my test. And I'm not saying this is any kind of a constitutional test. It's not. It's just my personal take on how this should be. So when you're dealing with firearms, the argument you always hear from the left is if we restrict the access to certain types of weapons, and I'm saying the left, I really mean the gun control left. Let's be clear about that. The gun control left will argue that, like, for example, the AR-15. They'll argue that if you ban the AR-15, you're going to get less shootings. Now, first of all, I want to point something out, and I'm going to just say this. Don't take my word for it. Check this for yourself. We had at a quote-unquote assault weapons ban that banned firearms, including the AR-15, back in the 90s under President Clinton. FBI statistics show that it made absolutely no difference to the violent crime rate or the homicide rate during that period of time, because the statistics show, if you look them up, and again, don't take my word for them, go check it yourself, go to DOJ, go to the Department of Justice website, because this is all public record, you can look it up. The statistics show a steady decline in violent crime and homicide since the 1980s. It declined when we had the gun control measure in place. It continued to decline after the measure sunsetted. It's been on a long-term decline. A lot of this is because of we had a spike in violent crime and murder during the 80s because of the crack epidemic. It had nothing to do with firearms and everything to do with drugs. It's been on the decline for a long time. All the evidence dealing with violent crime and homicide shows that gun control has no impact on that. Now, if you want to talk about rational and legit reasons why you would support banning any kind of a weapon, whether it be the AR-15 or whether it be a freaking Morningstar, obviously the argument's going to revolve around public safety. Obviously. So here's the deal. If gun control measures are actually effective in improving public safety, one would expect to see a overall decline in violent crime when gun control measures are enacted. That would be logical. That would be the assumption of what you would... That would be what you would assume you would get if these measures were actually effective at reducing violent crime. Is you get this reduction. They're effective public safety measures. The evidence is that they have no impact. Now, less restrictive laws also have no impact. So, in other words, it's a wash either way. So why are we going to invade people's rights just so, just when it's pretty clear that these measures don't reduce violent crime? And if you want more evidence of this, here's something else to think about for a second. When you hear gun control advocates, and it's the gun control advocates that talk about this, not pretty much anybody when they talk about crime otherwise talks about violent and non-violent crime and homicide specifically, because that's one of the homicide crimes are among the worst. So, but gun control advocates don't use the term violent crime. What you hear them talk about is gun crime. Now, why do you suppose this is? Probably because if they start talking about violent, they have no argument, because violent crime's been on the decline for decades overall in this country. So they want to talk about gun crime, and they want to massage the statistics to support their argument, that to make it look like there's this big rash of people getting shot. Well, here's my response to that. I agree with you that shootings are tragic. I certainly agree. Anybody who's shot and killed, that's a tragedy. even go so far as to say these idiot criminals that get themselves shot by the police. It's still a tragedy because that person is somebody's son, somebody's somebody's brother potentially, somebody's spouse potentially, somebody's father potentially, or somebody's sister, mother, daughter. So yes, it is a tragedy for the family of that person that they got shot and killed. That's my feeling about it. Nevertheless, if we're going to be wholly pragmatic about this, which is what I would argue before you start passing laws, laws should grow from pragmatism and logic, not emotion. So, using pragmatism and logic, here's my point. If the violent crime rate is unchanged by gun control, then one would have to draw one of two conclusions. Either the gun control measure is ineffective in stemming the availability of weapons to criminals, because that's who's doing this. They're criminals. They're people who commit crimes. Or alternatively, people who want to do violent crimes are finding other weapons to do violent crimes with, and it's probably a combination of those two. There is a huge black market in firearms in this country. It's not going to go anywhere just because you change a law. I mean, you guys, if you think that's true, you are not paying very close attention to history in this country. Because there's a perfect example of why those laws aren't necessarily going to guarantee you don't have a black market. Let's look at drugs, because I brought that up earlier. Now, heroin and cocaine have been restricted in some form or fashion in this country since the real early 1900s when the Harrison Act passed. Now, that was a tax act, but it basically put a tax stamp on heroin and cocaine. The war on drugs has been going on really since Reagan was president, back early 80s. And really before that, it was still a crime if you had heroin or cocaine or weed. Heroin and cocaine are the ones I really want to focus on, though. And the reason is these are drugs that are not produced domestically. They're smuggled in. Cocaine, for the most part, comes from South America. Heroin comes from South America, Mexico, and some from the Middle East and the Far East. Because it is produced in Afghanistan. So they got to be smuggled in. I think, and if I'm wrong about this, I'll own it, but I think arguably these drugs have been restricted in some form or fashion for over 100 years. We can't keep them out of our country. Heroin is a huge problem. Cocaine is still a reasonably large problem. Some of that's getting supplanted by meth, but it's still a big problem. We can't keep that stuff out. So and there's a massive black market. And a lot of the reason why we can't keep it out and there's a black market is because there's money to be made. A lot of it. Because despite the fact that as a country we have criminalized drug abuse, recreational pharmaceutical use, if you want to put it in somewhat more technical terms, the reality is, as a people, we're eating that stuff up. There's a huge demand for it. That's why these criminal gangs, because they're really, when you boil it down, we use the term gang, but what they are, especially at the cartel level, it's a business. It's an illegal business, but it is a business. They're there to make money. And they're smuggling in these drugs because it pays them a lot of money. The demand feeds the continued supply. In other words, because there's a demand, we will have a continued supply to meet that demand, because ain't nobody ever going to let that one float away. I mean, they are not. They're not. So my kind of sort of point here, for what it's worth, as long as there's a demand, these illegal goods will still be available. And if you ban a particular type of firearm, you're not necessarily going to dry up the demand for that firearm. It's certainly not amongst criminals. Criminals who use guns to commit crimes will continue to use guns to commit crimes. That's pretty well unavoidable. And here's the problem. There's a problem as I see it anyway. You ban these guns, you are probably looking at a situation where you're just going to get a black market. There are going to be those people who are going to want the gun and aren't going to care that it's crime. And they will continue to acquire those guns on the black market. And that means they'll still be out there in circulation to be used by violent criminals. And so, this fantasy that you're going to reduce gun crime by banning them is just that. It's a fantasy, because that will not drive up the demand by criminals. That's one problem. Number two, if somebody's really hell-bent on doing damage, they can always get a weapon. It may not be a firearm, but they can get a weapon. I mean, as a perfect example is Britain's been having a rash of stabbings because they've had this problem with basically guns are harder to get there, so the criminals have resorted to using knives. Same problem, the intent's there. They're going to get a weapon. Y'all remember Timothy McVeigh? He didn't need a gun. He killed a lot of people with fertilizer and diesel fuel. You can get these products. It's ammonium nitrate fertilizer, just to be accurate about it. But these are products you can buy at the store, or you can order it off the internet. There are chemical warehouses. You can order all kinds of goodies. And my point is, ban it all you like. You're not going to stop these people. Somebody wants to kill people, they're going to kill people. That's one thing that the NRA is correct about. And you can't possibly hope to ban every last implement that somebody with malicious intent could potentially use to harm their fellow man. That's the second thing. And, the statistics bear this out. And here's the thing. You can talk about gun crime all you like and reducing gun crime. You haven't gained anything in terms of a net public safety gain if you reduce shootings, but you get an increase in stabbings. Somebody is shot to death or stabbed to death, they're still dead. It's not gaining anything. It's not. All you've done is invade people's rights. And the ones who are going to be the most powerfully impacted by these types of laws are going to be people who are law-abiding. A law-abiding person is going to, if the law changes and they're told they can't own a particular type of weapon anymore, they may grumble, but they'll probably turn it in. The ones who won't turn it in are the criminals. The ones who are out there who don't have a lot of regard for the law and their fellow citizens will still have weapons. And hell, a lot of these people that are real hardcore criminals own weapons that are, they're illegal under current law. As of right now, under current law, you cannot own a firearm if you have a felony conviction. There's still felons kiting around with guns because they don't care. They're criminals, and criminals do criminal stuff. And it's naive to believe that you can change the law and somehow magically make these guns unavailable. There will be a black market. There is one now. if they can't divert firearms from legitimate dealers, they will acquire them in other means. Because at the end of the day, a firearm is really just a machine, and it's a bunch of machine parts. That's what it is. It's a bunch of machine parts. And the result is, if someone wanted to smuggle it, even if you could put metal detectors at every port of entry. There are a lot of ports of entry now. I'm less certain about the land borders. They may be there, I'm not sure. Been a while since I've gone across a land border in this country. It doesn't matter. I'm going to tell you right now, it doesn't matter. You want to see how easy, what I'm talking about. Take a firearm and strip it down. Field strip it. And if you don't know what the term field stripping means, it means you take the gun apart to its major constituent parts. You don't necessarily take apart like the firing, the trigger assembly and things like that, but you'll take the barrel out, you take the recoil spring out, you might take out the firing pin assembly. My reasoning is, if you break it down and look at it, what it is a bunch of machine parts. If you strip a firearm down enough, what you get are a bunch of machine parts. Are they going to ding a metal detector? Absolutely. They're not going to raise red flags because it's a spring, a tube of metal. Sheet metal, pieces of plastic, something that might look like an awl. That's what it would strip down to eventually, if you strip it down small enough. And honestly, with enough expertise, a person can go to a machine shop and manufacture these components and build their own firearm. Now, firearms are built to pretty tight specifications, but it's just a bunch of machine parts. If there's enough money involved, you will see them manufactured illegally and sold illegally. Because if there's a demand for it, somebody somewhere is going to meet that demand if they can make money at it. Need another example? How about kiddie porn? Kiddie porn is another example of, and just bringing that up is probably going to get this video flagged by YouTube, but it's a niche market for kiddie porn, because the ones who are consuming it are pedophiles. But there's still a market for it, and there's money to be made, and people will sell it and trade in it. And the reality is even though it carries a very strict penalty, and really, getting caught with kiddie porn is worse than getting caught with drugs, because the stigma, even amongst other criminals, is much higher. But people still do it because there's money to be made. And as long as there's that demand and there's money to be made, someone somewhere is going to chase that money. So it's a fantasy to think you can just make them unavailable. How do you address the issue of mass shootings? I think the first thing is doing a better job of identifying dangerous persons before they have a chance to act, and this is a balancing act. Obviously, you don't want to be locking someone up for the mere suspicion of maybe they might do something. But, and this is the other side of this argument, if someone is dangerous and they've made an overt move in the direction of harming someone, if you can't put them in jail, maybe putting them in the mental hospital until they cool their jets might be an option. That's one thing. And again, I think this is a balancing act. It really demands a very, very, very careful case-by-case analysis, because it could be abused. On the other side of it, the other thing you can do is eliminate soft targets as much as you can. There's a reason why you hear about schools getting shot up and not police stations, and not you did have that shooting on a military reservation, but they don't go after the MPs. Why do you suppose that is? Because they're armed. Police are armed. At the end of the day, these shooters, a lot of them don't care if they're killed, but they are predatory criminals. They're going to go after a soft target because their object is to kill as many people as possible before they get themselves killed or they commit suicide. If you attack a hardened target, you're just going to get yourself killed immediately. You know where else they don't go shooting up much? Call centers. Call centers are a good example. And call centers, ironically, are more secure than schools in most cases. Call center, if you've never worked in one or been in one, most professional call centers are secured access buildings. At least any of the ones I've been inside. And you usually have to have a proximity badge just to walk through the door, because it's automatically electrically locked from the outside. So, and the point of that is to control access, to keep people, to make sure that people coming in there have a reason to be there. A lot of them have security guards at the door. Not always armed security, but security guards. And then many times you'll have different sections of the call center broken out, again with these same proximity badge security doors. If you don't have the right badge, you're not getting in, period. Because the door's locked, and it's usually a nice heavy, if it's not steel, it's heavy hardwood solid core doors. I wouldn't say it's an armored door. If somebody wanted to get in bad enough, they probably could. But it at least would slow a person down. Someone who is trying to kill as many people as possible before the cops show up is going to get slowed down a lot by this. And yeah, I guess you could shoot through the door with a rifle, but the problem with doing that as a practical matter is you can't see what you're shooting at. So you could shoot somebody or not. And you know, the Hollywood stunt of shooting the door until you put a hole through it and then reach through, that works a lot better in Hollywood than it does in real life. In real life, you could shoot a lot of holes in the door and the door would still keep its structural integrity. That's just reality. So it's a fantasy. So my point is these are structures that you don't typically hear about getting shot up by these mass shooters. And I would posit, I don't know this for a fact, but it seems reasonable, that it's probably because they're hard targets. School is an easy target. A lot of schools don't have a lot of security. They may have a rule like you have to sign in at the desk, but there's no one there really to enforce it. If they, somebody wanted to get in to do something nefarious, they could. Inner city schools may have metal detectors, which would make it harder to carry a gun into school. You get into the inner city, most schools don't have metal detectors. Most schools don't secure their windows. There are schools that don't lock their exterior doors, even if it's not the main entrance. Those kind of measures, stupid, simple things like that, have security, have a metal detector, have doors that aren't always unlocked. They can be unlocked from the inside. That's the beauty of these electrically locked doors. It's actually magnetic, is usually how they work, but the point I'm getting at is they're always unlocked from the inside. So if you have a fire, you can get out. And you can get out pretty easily. But you just can't get in as easily if you don't have the proper credential. Why they don't adopt this in public schools is beyond me. Because that kind of measure would at least slow it down. It would discourage it in those locations. The reality is you can't harden every last location. I don't know about you guys. I don't want to go through a TSA type checkpoint just to go shopping at the mall. That would annoy the heck out of me and it would make me not go. Because I don't like that. And I would rather just have the mall let me carry my concealed carry weapon. Granted, if somebody's got a rifle, I'm going to be outmatched, but I'd rather be armed than not. What do you do about malls? Well, I think mall security could be better trained. Make sure they're armed. Have video cameras everywhere. A lot of malls already have that, but I think armed security isn't a bad idea, as long as it doesn't get like really stupid. I think it's a good idea to I also think it's a good idea to kind of train the public. You see this sometimes at the Amtrak stations and airports, and this is actually something that it's a really good message, and I agree with it. I think the presentation could be better. Is what they tell people, what the message you'll see, and it's usually on posters around, is see something, say something. It's a great message. What that is look, if you see something that looks off, don't just look the other way, because you never know what that person might be up to. Why I say the presentation is off is you see it at the airport sometimes, you see it at the train station sometimes. Why is this not this is my question. Why is this not a PSA? I mean, we get PSAs for all kinds of dumb reasons. Stupid stuff. Why are we not doing PSAs on TV about, hey guys, you're your own best security? Because the reality is, you can have mall security, you can have school security, you can have TSA at the airport, TSA at the Amtrak stations, and cops out on the streets. They're not numerous enough to watch everywhere all the time. Even with video cameras, they can only observe so much at a given time. Public citizens, though, are literally millions of pairs of eyes. Billions of pairs of eyes. And if people wouldn't be so dang oblivious, be situationally aware. Because you know what? You see the guy who's looking shady and has a long trench coat on in the summer, and call security. If that guy does have a rifle under his coat, there's a better chance that he'll be stopped before he can really cause harm. I mean, those kind of measures are reasonable. And they don't involve stripping people of their rights. And if it's done properly, you're not imposing a police state. You're just telling citizens, be situationally aware. Keep your bloody eyes open. Don't assume somebody else is paying attention when you're not. I mean, that's a simple thing that could be done everywhere at once. It doesn't really cost that much, other than just spreading the word. Run some TV ads, and yeah, I think it would help. Criminals typically don't mess with people who are hard targets, and someone who's observant is less likely to get messed with than somebody who's got their head in a pair of earphones. And at the end of the day, that's what these folks are, is they're criminals. They're predatory criminals, and like any predatory criminal, they're looking for the soft target. I also think the media could do something in this situation. There was a really good video done on the Alternative History Hub about mass shootings. And I will give this guy credit for not being political about it. But his point was, you know what? If the media would stop sensationalizing it, it would be less attractive. Because a lot of these folks are people that feel like nobodies, that are looking to get attention. It's what they want. They want attention. And they're going to get it by murdering people. Now, there are some of them that are motivated as terrorists. The San Bernardino's shooting was a terrorist. Although even with terrorism, it's really only effective if you get press, because the people you kill are dead. You're not going to scare them because they're dead. The point of terrorism is to scare people to push your agenda. And if you don't get press, it is going to be less effective. Also, same rules apply in terms of vigilance. Again, you catch these little turds before they have a chance to do something. I think some of these, maybe not all of them, some of these things could be stopped, at least before it becomes a real tragedy. I want to shift gears a little bit on this now. Because there's something else I want to talk about. I think the other thing with these shootings to understand, it is not an epidemic in the way that it's being propagandized. Is it a problem? Yes. When I say it's a problem in the same way as when someone is killed in any other homicide, it's a problem. As much as we're able to, we want to reduce all homicides. Do I think it's a unique problem or some big rash, recent outcropping of violence? No, I think it's a problem. But it's something you need to take in context. You have better odds of being killed in a car wreck than being killed by a mass shooter. Drunk drivers are a much more serious safety threat in terms of the raw numbers. Many more people are hurt and killed by drunk drivers. And the irony of it is drunk driving is a less serious offense. And no one is out, well, I shouldn't say no one. It doesn't get the press and the outrage from most circles that these shootings get. And you don't get people running around saying ban booze and ban cars because of drunk driving. What you typically get is people who are like, we want stiffer penalties on people that drive drunk. And that's a far more serious problem. The opioid addiction is a far more serious problem. Heart disease kills more people than any other cause statistically in this country. Doesn't get the same level of outrage. Doesn't get people running around talking about restricting rights in most circles. Yes, you have extremists who want to do dumb things like, let's ban large sugary drinks or dumb things like that. But, it's not a widespread movement in the way that gun control is. I'm going to wrap this video up pretty soon here because I think I've said most of what I want to say. I think it should be taken seriously with mass shootings. I think it should be understood in context too, though. And I do not think we should be sacrificing rights in the name of let's do something. And there is one last thing I want to address, because you hear this a lot from gun control advocates, is they want to point to countries like the UK or Australia where they have strict gun laws and say, since they changed their laws, they haven't had a mass shooting. I'm going to respond to this quickly because I don't really think it deserves a lot of lengthy exposition. Couple of things. One, these countries you're not comparing apples to apples. They're different countries. They're different culturally. They have different crime statistics. And it's really the violent crime and homicide rates that you need to pay attention to, because mass shootings are really why we should care about them is the public safety aspect. So again, same deal. Does it really reduce violent crime? Does it reduce homicide? That's the really should be the yardstick. But here's what I'm going to say. UK is an island nation. One. So getting illegal stuff in there is going to be harder than a country with land borders like ours. That's the first thing. Secondly, culturally, the UK is distinct from the United States. Yes, there are similarities, but with the UK, you have a long history of restrictions on private ownership of weapons by the ordinary citizen. Even before the existence of firearms, they had restrictions on the ownership of military weapons. I mean, this goes all the way back to William the Conqueror. And if you ever do any studying on that period, there were laws passed under William the Conqueror restricting the ownership by non-nobility, especially non-Normans, of military weaponry, i.e. swords and armor. It's why they invented the longbow, because bows were considered a hunting weapon, and they were acceptable. And what they never counted on was the idea that the bowmen would come back with a bow powerful enough to punch through their armor. But my point is the British public has been under these rules, for good or ill, for many years, millennia. So culturally, they don't have the same relationship with weapons as the United States. One of the problems you have here in trying to ban weapons is the same problem that they're running into with pot. The public will not accept that it's morally wrong, and when the public doesn't accept it's morally wrong, what you get is a lot of people in the public who are going to say, screw the law, I disagree with it, I don't think it's anything wrong, either I'm going to ignore it, or I'm going to not say anything if someone else is ignoring it, because it's not seen as morally wrong. You're going to get a lot more pushback here because of that. So I don't think that's a good measure. They don't have the drug problem we have either, which is another issue. So I don't think the force of demand in Britain is going to be as high as it is here for firearms. And as I say, they're culturally distinct. Their crime rates are going to be distinct because of that. Same with Japan. Same with Australia. Same with New Zealand. They're culturally distinct. So you're not comparing apples to apples. It's a false comparison. Also, that type of an argument is basically what we call in logic a correlation equals causation argument. Just because you can say that if I find A, I'm more likely to find B, doesn't mean that A caused B. But anyway, I'm not going to spend any more time on discussing that issue because I don't think it really warrants a lot of discussion. The bottom line is it's a trashy argument, especially when you can look at statistics in the United States that were generated by our Department of Justice, that is our federal law enforcement nerve center, that clearly show that when we had federal gun control laws, we had a federal assault weapons ban already once. It had no impact on violent crime. It had no impact on homicide. So I don't care if you really want to believe that these measures somehow magically worked in other countries, they clearly don't work here because the statistics don't support it. And there you're not talking correlation equals, well, I mean, I don't know if you are or you aren't, but the point is it clearly did not have any impact. So the bottom line is, these are not going to do anything for the issue of violent crime. They're just not. What you are doing is invading people's rights. That's all you're doing. And you're invading the rights of people who have done nothing wrong. I understand and appreciate how people, and I guess I will wrap this up with one last comment. This has gone longer than I planned on, but this is something else that comes to mind. People like David Hogg. Honestly, I feel sorry for the kid, not in a pity sense, but in an empathy sense, because he was a young boy, really. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I mean it just, he was a boy. And was exposed to an act of horrific violence. So I will say this is a kid that has every right to be angry. Now, that being said, yes, he has the right to be angry, as does any other victim of crime of any kind, violent or otherwise. Does that mean that anger equals he's beyond question and you can't ever challenge his views, challenge his positions? No. Because, see, here's my point. He also is advocating for the worst sort of gun control without understanding it. And unfortunately, I think the kid's a true believer, not because he's thought it out, but because he's motivated by emotion. And he has a right to feel emotional about it. It's a traumatic event. It's a horrible thing. He's wrong. And I mean that respectfully, and it doesn't mean it takes anything away from his experience, but doesn't make him an expert on all things firearms or policy related. And I think that's all I'm going to say about that for right now. I'm going to sign off. It's a great night signing off.